Hunger makes you do terrible things. It strips away pride, then hope, and finally, the only thing you have left to love. She tied the frayed rope to the hitching post. She turned her back. And if the broad-shouldered man in the bearskin coat hadn't been watching from the shadows, that would have been the end of them both. The mud in the mining camp of Black Creek didn't just coat your boots, it swallowed them. It was a thick, freezing sludge of snowmelt, horse dung, and pulverized rock. Cora stood in the middle of it, letting the cold seep through the cracked leather of her soles. She didn't feel it, or rather, she chose not to. At the end of the rope in her hand sat Rusty. He was a mix of bloodhound and something meaner, though the meanness had been starved out of him weeks ago. His ribs pushed against his brindle coat like the staves of a broken barrel. He looked up at her, tail giving a weak, rhythmic thump against the frozen mud. He trusted her. That was the worst part. Cora looked at the facade of the slaughterhouse. The smell of copper and rot hung thick in the freezing air. 3 days. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, giving the last heel of hardtack to the dog. She was coughing up a thin, bloody phlegm, and her vision kept swimming with dark spots. The boarding house had thrown her out when the laundry shut down. Black Creek was a town for men pulling silver from the earth. It had no use for a sick, destitute woman, and it certainly had no use for a hungry dog. She gripped the rough hemp rope. It bit into her cracked palms. She walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the slaughterhouse. A man stepped out, wiping a stained apron with a rag. He had a face like a slab of raw beef, red and indifferent. "We don't take strays, lady," he grunted, before she even opened her mouth. "Got enough trouble keeping the wolves off the offal out back." "I don't want money for him." Cora's voice was a dry scrape. It hurt to speak. Just, he's a good dog. He catches rats. He's quiet. You could use him to guard the yard. The butcher spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the snow. "He looks like he ain't got the strength to chew a bone, let alone a thief. Tie him to the post over there. I'll put a bullet in his head when I finish my shift. Best I can do." Cora stopped breathing. The cold wind howled down the alley, biting at her exposed neck. Put a bullet in his head. It was a mercy. She knew it was a mercy. In the wild, he would freeze, or the coyotes would tear him apart. Here, it would be quick. She looked down at Rusty. He whined, a high, thin sound, and leaned his heavy head against her shin. Tears, hot and shameful, finally spilled over her dirt-smudged cheeks. She wiped them away furiously with the back of her sleeve. There was no room for crying out here. Crying didn't fill a belly. "All right," she whispered. She walked to the thick oak hitching post. Her fingers were numb, clumsy as she looped the rope around the wood. She tied a knot. She didn't look at the dog. If she looked at his eyes, she would untie him, and they would both freeze to death in a snowbank by morning. She dropped to her knees into the freezing mud. She buried her face in the dusty, coarse fur of his neck. Rusty licked the salt from her cheek. "I'm sorry." She breathed into his coat. "I'm so sorry, boy." She stood up. She didn't look back. She took one step, then another. The mud sucked at her boots. Knots, sloppy. The voice sounded like rocks grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. Deep, resonant. Cora stopped and turned. A man was standing near the edge of the alley. He was massive, built like a wall of granite, draped in heavy canvas and a thick coat of dark fur. A wide-brimmed hat obscured the top half of his face, but she could see a thick, dark beard peppered with gray, and a mouth set in a hard, uncompromising line. He smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and old leather. He stepped forward. He didn't look at Cora. He looked at the dog. Rusty shrank back for a second, then sniffed the air. The dog didn't growl. "You leave a dog tied like that, he'll choke himself trying to get loose," the man said. His tone wasn't mean. It was entirely flat. Fact. Cora's jaw trembled. "He won't be tied for long. The butcher is going to handle it." The man shifted his gaze to her. His eyes were pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky right before a blizzard. They took in her thin shawl, the hollows of her cheeks, the way she was shivering so hard her teeth clicked. He saw everything in a 2-second glance. He judged none of it. "You starving?" he asked. Cora's spine stiffened. Pride was a stupid thing to die for, but it flared anyway. That is none of your concern. Dog starving, the man observed, crouching down. He pulled a piece of dried jerky from a deep pocket. He didn't offer it to Rusty. He held it in his flat palm, letting the dog make the choice. Rusty practically inhaled it, nearly taking the man's leather glove with it. The man didn't flinch. I can't feed him, Cora said, her voice cracking, betraying her. I don't have a copper piece to my name. I don't have a roof. I can't keep him. The mountain man stood up slowly. He towered over her. He looked past her, toward the bustling, indifferent street of the mining camp, then down at the dog, and finally back to her. I trap up in the Bitterroots, he said. Name's Amos. Got a cabin. It's solid, but it's quiet. Too quiet. He paused, adjusting the strap of a heavy canvas pack on his shoulder. I need a dog. Bears get bold come early spring. Need a warning system. Amos looked at Rusty. He's got a good chest on him. Put some meat on his bones. He'll bark loud enough. Cora stared at him. You want my dog? I'll take the dog. Amos reached out and easily untied the knot she had struggled with. But dogs pine. He looks like a one-woman hound. He'll chew through a door to get back down the mountain to find you. I ain't fixing chewed doors. Cora didn't understand. The cold was making her thoughts sluggish. Then, what are you saying? Amos looked her dead in the eye. I'm saying I got a trap line that takes me away 3 days out of 7. When I come back, the fire's dead, and the meat needs smoking. I need a cabin keeper. You need a roof and a meal. He gestured down to the dog. He needs both of us. So, you come too. It wasn't a proposal. It was a transaction. Cora stared at the giant of a man, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked for the catch. Men in mining camps didn't offer favors to destitute women without expecting something dark and heavy in return. She knew the currency of this world. I won't be your whore, she said. The words tasted like ash, but she forced them out, keeping her chin leveled at his chest. Amos didn't blink. The stoic expression on his bearded face didn't shift by a millimeter. Didn't ask for one, he replied, his voice a low rumble. I asked for a firekeeper. You sleep in the loft. I sleep by the hearth. You keep the axes sharp, the meat salted, and the dog fed. That's the bargain. Take it or freeze. Makes no difference to the mountain. He turned and began walking away, his heavy boots crunching through the icy mud. He held the rope loosely. Rusty followed him for 2 steps, then stopped, pulling the line taut. The dog looked back at Cora, whining, a sound that tore right through her chest. She looked at the slaughterhouse. She looked at the filthy street. She had a small skinning knife tucked in her right boot. It wasn't much, but it was sharp. Wait, she called out. Amos stopped, but didn't turn around. Cora ran forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, grabbing the frayed end of her shawl. I'll come. Amos merely nodded once. Wagons at the livery. We leave in 10 minutes. The journey up the mountain was a slow, agonizing crawl out of the world she knew. The town of Black Creek disappeared behind a veil of towering pines and jagged granite faces. Amos drove a team of thick-necked mules pulling a heavy buckboard wagon loaded with salt, flour, black powder, and canvas. Cora sat on the wooden bench beside him, clutching Rusty against her side for warmth. The dog was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Amos had tossed to her without a word. They rode for hours in utter silence. The only sounds were the creak of the wooden wheels, the snorts of the mules, and the rhythmic clinking of the harness. The higher they climbed, the thinner and sharper the air became. It burned Cora's lungs, but it was clean. It didn't smell of sulfur and despair. It smelled of ancient pine and ancient ice. She watched Amos from the corner of her eye. He drove the team with a relaxed but absolute authority. His hands, encased in thick leather gloves, barely seemed to move, yet the mules navigated the treacherous, washed-out switchbacks perfectly. He was a part of this landscape. Hard, unyielding, quiet. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, the cold became a physical entity. It clawed at Cora's skin, finding every gap in her threadbare clothing. She began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Amos noticed. He didn't offer a platitude. He reached behind the seat, grabbed a massive, foul-smelling buffalo robe, and threw it over her and the dog. "Half-hour," was all he said. The cabin emerged from the darkening woods like a natural growth of the mountain itself. It wasn't built for aesthetics. It was built for war against the elements. Thick, unpeeled logs locked together tightly, chinked with mud and horsehair. The roof was heavy with snow, and a stone chimney clung to the side. Amos pulled the team to a halt. Inside, he instructed, jumping down. Firewood stacked by the door. "Get it started. I'll see to the animals." Cora didn't argue. She scrambled down, her legs numb and trembling, and pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, it was pitch black and freezing, smelling of stale ash and cured tobacco. She fumbled in the dark, her hands finding the rough bark of split logs. She found the hearth by touch, scraping a sulfur match against the stone. The small flare of yellow light revealed a sprawling, single-room cabin. A heavy wooden table sat in the center. Cast iron pans hung from the walls, next to a daunting array of steel traps. In the corner was a ladder leading to a half-loft. She built the fire. She blew on the embers until her vision spotted, nursing the small flame into a roaring blaze. Rusty curled up immediately on the braided rug in front of the hearth, sighing heavily. The door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and wind. Amos stepped inside, carrying a sack of flour and a hunk of frozen venison. He kicked the door shut. He moved around the cabin with a practiced, heavy grace, lighting 2 oil lamps. He threw the venison onto the table, grabbed a cleaver, and brought it down hard, hacking off a chunk. He tossed it into a cast-iron pot, added snow from a bucket, and hung it over the fire. He hadn't spoken a word. Cora stood near the fire, her hands hovering over the flames, watching him. She expected a demand, a threat, a reminder of her place. Instead, Amos pointed a thick finger toward the ladder. "Bedrolls up there, clean blankets in the chest. Stew will be ready in an hour. Eat, feed the dog, and sleep." He sat down in a heavy rocking chair, pulled a whetstone from his pocket, and began running a hunting knife over the gray stone. Shk, shk. Cora looked at him. Really looked at him. He wasn't a savior. He was a survivor, and he had just offered her a foothold on his mountain. She walked to the ladder, her boots heavy. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos didn't look up from the blade. "Don't thank me yet. Winter hasn't even started." The first 2 weeks were a brutal awakening. Survival up here was not a passive state. It was a daily, grinding labor. Amos was gone before the sun dragged itself over the eastern ridge. He left a list of chores carved in silence. Water had to be hauled from the creek, a terrifying process of smashing through 2 inches of ice while the freezing water splashed her skirts. Wood had to be split. The cabin had to be swept, the meat rotated in the small smokehouse out back. Cora's hands blistered, then bled, and finally turned to thick, yellow calluses. Her back ached constantly, but for the first time in months, her stomach wasn't a hollow, screaming void. Amos kept the larder stocked with salted pork, dried beans, and fresh game. Rusty thrived. The dog put on weight, his coat gaining a healthy, coarse sheen. He became Amos's shadow when the man was home, and Cora's fierce protector when he was gone. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but it slowly lost its edge. Amos was not a man who spoke just to fill the air. He spoke when a thing needed doing. "Axe is dull," he'd say, handing it to her before showing her the proper angle on the grindstone. "Snow's shifting," he'd murmur, looking out the frost-choked window. "Keep the dog close today. Cougars get hungry when the crust breaks." Cora learned to read him not by his words, but by his actions. She noticed that he always left the heaviest logs near the door, so she wouldn't have to carry them far. She noticed that when he butchered an elk, he always saved the marrow bones for Rusty, and she noticed that he never, not once, climbed the ladder to her loft. One evening in late November, a storm slammed into the mountain. The wind didn't howl, it screamed. It battered the thick logs of the cabin like physical fists. The temperature plummeted so fast the nails in the floorboards popped like distant gunfire. Cora was terrified. She sat on the floor near the hearth, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the flames dance violently in the draft. Amos sat in his chair, calmly mending a broken trap chain with a pair of heavy pliers. He didn't seem to notice the apocalypse happening outside. Suddenly, Rusty let out a sharp yelp from his spot near the door. He began licking furiously at his front paw. Amos dropped the trap. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee beside the dog. "Easy, boy," he rumbled. Cora scrambled over. "What's wrong? Is he hurt?" Amos took the dog's large paw in his massive, calloused hand. His touch, usually rough and utilitarian, was shockingly gentle. He parted the fur with his thumbs. "Splinter," Amos said. "From the threshold. Deep." He looked up at Cora. "Fetch my needle from the tin on the mantel. Hold his head." Cora did as she was told. She grabbed the heavy steel needle and hurried back, kneeling opposite Amos. She wrapped her arms around Rusty's thick neck, murmuring softly to him. The dog trembled but stayed still, trusting them both. Amos took the needle. He held the paw steady. "Gonna hurt for a second. Hold him tight." With a deft, precise motion, he dug the needle into the pad and flicked upward. Rusty yelped and jerked, but Cora held firm. Amos pulled a jagged, inch-long piece of oak from the dog's paw. "Got it," he said, tossing the bloody splinter into the fire. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin of bear grease, rubbing a generous amount into the wound. Rusty sniffed the grease, gave Amos's bearded cheek a quick lick, and settled back down with a heavy sigh. Amos wiped his hands on his canvas trousers and remained kneeling, looking at the dog. Then, slowly, he lifted his eyes to Cora. In the dim, flickering light of the fire, the shadows on his face softened. The flat, detached look in his eyes was gone, replaced by something tired, heavy, and undeniably human. "He's a brave dog," Amos said softly. "He's had to be," Cora replied, her voice trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, suffocating intimacy of the moment. The wind raged outside, but inside, the air was entirely still. "World's hard on things that don't bite back," Amos said, his gaze drifting from her eyes down to her scarred, calloused hands resting on the dog's fur. He reached out. For a second, Cora stopped breathing. She thought he was going to grab her hand. Instead, he gently traced the edge of a fresh, angry burn on her wrist, sustained from a splashing pot of beans 2 days prior. His touch was as light as a falling leaf. "You're learning to bite back," he murmured. He pulled his hand away, stood up, and went back to his chair. He picked up his pliers and his broken chain. Cora stayed on the floor with the dog for a long time, listening to the rhythm of the storm and the steady, grounding scrape of metal on metal. The mountain was still terrifying. The winter would be long and brutal, but as she watched the firelight dance across the broad expanse of Amos's shoulders, she realized something profound. She was no longer just surviving. She was home. January brought the deep freeze. The miners down in Black Creek called it the starving moon. Up on the ridge, it was simply the end of the world. The cold wasn't just a temperature anymore. It was an entity. It lurked outside the thick log walls, pressing against the frosted glass of the single window, waiting for the fire to die. Birds fell frozen from the pine branches, hitting the crust of the snow with hollow thuds. Amos had been gone 4 days. The bargain was 3. He had never been late, not by an hour. Cora sat at the heavy oak table. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a tin mug of chicory coffee, but she didn't drink. She stared at the door. Rusty paced the length of the cabin, his claws clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. Every few minutes, the dog would stop, press his broad nose against the crack under the door, and let out a low, vibrating whine. "I know," Cora whispered. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the immense silence of the cabin. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. If she panicked, the fire would go out. If she panicked, the dog would starve. She stood up, her movements deliberate and mechanical. She went to the hearth and threw 2 more split logs onto the fire. She watched the sparks fly up the chimney, counting them until her heartbeat slowed to a dull, heavy rhythm. By noon of the 5th day, the sky bruised purple. Another front was moving in. The wind began to shriek through the canyon, carrying fine, biting powder that looked like ground glass. Cora made a list in her head. It was how she kept the creeping dread at bay. Fuel: 3 days of wood stacked inside. Food: half a side of salt pork, 10 pounds of beans. Ammunition: 12 rounds for the heavy Sharps rifle. Time: running out. If Amos was trapped out there, he was already dead. The rational part of her mind, the part honed by the brutal pragmatism of the mining camp, told her to stay put. Bar the door. Survive. She looked at Rusty. The dog was standing by the door, looking back at her. He didn't whine this time. He just waited. Cora walked to the corner. She pulled on her heavy woolen trousers, then Amos's spare canvas coat, rolling the sleeves up past her wrists. She wrapped her threadbare shawl around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed. Finally, she picked up the heavy Sharps rifle. It was brutally heavy, the walnut stock cold and unyielding. Amos had made her fire it once. It had bruised her shoulder black and blue for a week, but she knew how to load it. "Find him," she said to the dog, pulling the heavy door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The cold instantly frosted her eyelashes. Rusty plunged into the knee-deep snow, his nose dropping instantly to the frozen crust. They walked for 3 hours. The world was a blinding, swirling white. Cora's legs burned, her lungs seized, and her toes lost all feeling. She followed the dog blindly, trusting his instincts over her own failing senses. They navigated the treacherous, washed-out switchbacks, moving deeper into the timberline where the ancient pines offered a sparse, mocking shelter from the wind. Then, Rusty stopped. The fur on his spine stood up in a rigid line. He let out a bark that was ripped away by the wind and bolted forward into a thicket of snow-draped spruce. Cora racked the lever of the rifle, her numb fingers slipping on the cold steel. She pushed through the heavy branches, the needles scraping her face. She found him in a ravine. A massive dead branch, a widowmaker, had snapped under the weight of the ice and come down. Amos was pinned beneath it. The thick oak limb lay diagonally across his right thigh. He wasn't moving. "Amos!" Cora screamed, dropping the rifle into the snow. She scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding the last 10 feet, her knees hitting the ice hard. He was entirely pale. His lips tinged a terrifying, lifeless blue. Frost clung to his beard and eyebrows. He had managed to hack away part of the branch with his hatchet. It lay in the snow, the handle slick with frozen blood, but he had passed out before he could finish the job. Cora grabbed his face. His skin was like stone. "Amos, Amos, wake up." His eyelids fluttered. They were sluggish, fighting the heavy pull of hypothermia. His pale blue eyes locked onto her. It took him a long moment to process what he was seeing. "Told you to stay by the hearth," he rasped. His voice was barely a breath, sounding like dry leaves scraping over rock. "Shut up," Cora said, her voice cracking. She looked at the branch. It was easily 200 pounds of dense, waterlogged wood. She couldn't lift it. She grabbed the bloody hatchet from the snow. Her hands were shaking violently, but she didn't stop to think. She swung the blade into the notch Amos had started. Thwack! Wood chips flew into her face. She swung again. Thwack! "Cora," Amos breathed. "Leave it, too heavy. Sun's going down." "I said shut up," she snarled, swinging the hatchet with a desperate, feral strength. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned. She didn't feel the blisters tearing open on her palms beneath her heavy gloves. Rusty dug furiously at the snow beneath Amos's leg, trying to clear space. It took 20 agonizing minutes of chopping. Finally, the wood groaned. Cora dropped the hatchet, wedged her shoulder under the thicker end of the severed branch, and heaved. The world went black at the edges of her vision. She pushed upward with her legs, screaming against the weight. The branch rolled off his thigh with a sickening crunch. Amos let out a sharp, choked gasp, his head falling back against the snow. "Can you stand?" Cora asked, her chest heaving. Amos looked at his leg. The thick canvas of his trousers was torn, the fabric soaked in dark, freezing blood. "Bones intact," he muttered, gritting his teeth. "Muscle is chewed up." "I can't walk. Then I'll drag you." She scrambled back up the embankment and broke off 2 long, sturdy pine boughs. She dragged them down, using Amos's spare belt and her own shawl to lash them together into a